Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Sophia, your host. A recent CBC Fifth Estate episode about polygamy has sparked debate amongst Muslims. The investigative report featured an Imam who officiates marriages for men who want to have a second wife. Some of these marriages are kept secret from the first wife. Because the marriages are not recognized or registered under Canadian law, the women in these relationships forgo their legal rights and can be treated unjustly by their husbands. So now we have to ask, why was the practice of polygamy permitted according to the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad? And should polygamy be practiced in Canada? Here to discuss the subject with me, Dr. Shabir Ali, our resident scholar, and also my father. Dr. Shabir Ali, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
Now, many people have commented, many Muslims are particularly concerned about this report because they feel that it's sensationalized the Muslim community. I do want to make it clear that this is not a prevalent practice. Polygamy is not prevalent in the Muslim community. It's practiced by a very tiny percentage. But at the same time, this tiny percentage is getting the validation for polygamy from, it seems, the Quran and the practice of the Prophet Muhammad. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. You can tell us what the Quran says about polygamy.
Yeah, if you don't mind, before I go there, I just want to make a comment about the sensationalism, and I want to advise Muslims to be clear and focus on our religious teachings and make it such that when we practice our religion, nobody has any reason to complain or to find fault with our faith. Mm-hmm. To a large extent, we misrepresent the faith, and so we give the media an edge. They want sensationalism, and we're providing it for them. So we shouldn't so much blame the media, but we should blame ourselves for creating this sort of atmosphere. Mm-hmm. Now back to your question.
Yes.
Now, the Quran does, in fact, literally read, permit a man to have up to 4 wives at once. In fact, if one want to take it even more literally, then there is no limitation, actually, about for the number of wives a man could have. It says married in 2s and 3s and 4s, but it doesn't say anything about 5 or 6 or 7.
Okay.
So the classical interpretation that emerged out of this is that men are limited to 4.
That's a common understanding.
That's a common understanding, and in fact, it's good understanding because if 4 is really quite a large number already.
Yes.
And the classical Muslim jurists and interpreters looked at it from the perspective that a man could hardly be expected to do justice to 4 women at once, much less to think of more than that number. But that's the classical interpretation. And I want to say now that we need to go back and look at it carefully and see that what the Quran was saying, in fact, is that if you fear that you will not do justice to the orphans, then marry the women who are suitable for you in 2s and 3s and 4s. This is in the 4th chapter of the Quran, the 3rd verse. Anyone can read it for themselves.
So what do orphans have to do with this?
Well, this is the important point. See, there's an if-then statement. If you fear you will not do justice to the orphans. The way I understand that is that after the Battle of Uhud, which occurred in the 3rd year after the Prophet, peace be upon him, migrated away from his hometown, he wanted to live in peace, but the non-Muslims wanted to kill off the Muslims, so they marched against the Muslims with one army after another. First at the Battle of Badr, the 2nd year after the migration, now in the 3rd year, the Battle of Uhud. In that particular battle, 70 of the Muslim soldiers were killed. So what was to be done with their widows and their children, now orphaned children? This was not a welfare state like we have today, where children get a handout and the mother will control the money and have enough to look after herself and the children. So in that society, what the Quran was encouraging the men to do was to take on additional wives from among these widows of their fallen soldiers, so that by so doing they would protect the orphans. So that's the point of the statement. If you fear that you as a society will not be doing justice to the orphans, then marry the women who are suitable for you, meaning the mothers of the orphans, in 2s and 3s and 4s, so that it doesn't mean literally 2s and 3s and 4s, but it's saying like marry more, so that you can take care of the orphans and the women. In fact, by putting it such, the Quran was sensitive to the emotions of the women in that circumstance, because if you go to a woman in that circumstance in a traditional Muslim society and say, well, look, looks like you just lost your husband, ha ha ha, now I can marry you. It's not going to go down very well. But if you say, well, you know, your children, I feel for them, they are my brother's children, and I would like to take care of them, give me that opportunity. And she knows what's going to follow, because if you're going to have such a close association with the family, you're going to look after the children, perhaps that can lead to some compromising situations between man and woman. So the best way to preserve the morality in that society was to marry the widows and thereby take care of her and her orphaned children at the same time. So that's to me what the Quran was speaking about. And then it follows up by saying, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً, and if you fear that you will not do justice, then marry only one. So the bottom line seems to be that marrying one is really the default situation, but there can be some situations in history, as has occurred, where large numbers of men are suddenly killed off, and you need to deal with the widows and the orphaned children.
But I mean, what you're saying, what the Quran seems to offer is a very specific, you know, polygamy is allowed in a very specific circumstance, in a specific context. But on the other hand, we know that the Prophet Muhammad also practiced polygamy. He had many wives, and people around him practiced polygamy as well, and polygamy has continued through the ages.
Yes, so I'm not saying that the Quran itself said that you cannot marry more than this, and that the Quran is limiting it to this particular circumstance. I'm only saying that the verse in question speaks about this circumstance. Now, people have generalized from the verse to make the verse mean this for all times and all places, and more so, they have forgotten the if clause of the verse. Now, if we say that based on the practice of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions, we should take this as a rule for all time, then it's not a Quranic rule, then you're basing it on the practice of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So that's fine, but we should be clear what you're basing the practice on. Don't say it's the Quran if it's not the Quran. If it's the practice of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, say it is the practice of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And now let's go to see what was his practice actually. We see that when he was about 25 years old, that's when he got married for the first time, and he remained married to the one wife until she passed away. And he was 50 years old at the time. That means for 25 years of his life, the prime of his life and youth, he was married to only one woman. And that means by getting married to other women subsequently, he was not hurting the first wife. And what often happens in polygamous marriages nowadays is that a man gets married to a woman when she's a virgin, she bears his children, and when she reaches middle age or in her late 40s, when she's no longer that physically attractive to him as she was at one time, now he turns his attention elsewhere and he marries a younger woman. And naturally, this hurts the first wife. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, never did that. He never hurt his first wife. In fact, the first wife remained in his living memory to the jealousy of the remaining wives. So they would be in his presence, and he would still be thinking about the first wife and showing affection to people who are connected to the first wife, relatives, and so on. So those who say they're following the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in this are not actually following him. They're doing the contrary.
I understand there was a certain situation where there was a suggestion that the Prophet's daughter be considered, you know, her husband marry a second woman, and the Prophet Muhammad objected to that.
Yes, and in fact, he said it's not going to happen, and he said it in a very emphatic way, like, you know, it's absolutely not. And he did give Ali the option that if he wanted, he could divorce Fatima and then marry somebody else. But he said that if you hurt Fatima, then you're hurting me. And that shows that the real concern and the fact of the matter is that women do get hurt in such relationships.
What about secret marriages? Because we've had some imams, I guess a minority of imams, who are telling Muslim men that they can marry somebody secretly without telling their first wife. Is that permitted in Islam?
Well, some do this because they don't want to hurt the first wife, or they don't want to cause commotion within the existing relationship. But is it allowed? If we say that something is allowed, it doesn't mean that we approve of it. It means that, you know, sometimes it's many things in society, people think there ought to be a law against that. But now to make this a law and to start enforcing it and so on, that itself may go in the wrong direction. So it is not right. This is what I would say. It's not right for people to do this. In the first place, I encourage the Muslim brothers to remain married to one wife, to be devoted to her. You enter into a marriage relationship, enter into it for life. You know, be kind to your wife and don't do anything that will hurt her. And marrying a second wife will surely hurt the first one. And of course, there may be exceptions. Maybe a particular woman says, oh, it's fine with me if my husband has a second wife. If that's fine, that's between you and them. Of course, you can't do that in Canada in any case because this will go against the bigamy laws of Canada.
Well, there's a loophole, right? Because if you don't report it, as some imams say, then it's not necessarily considered illegal. It's just considered cohabitation.
Well, now that loophole in the law has been closed because according to Canadian law, if anything is called a marriage, even in your religious context, then this too counts as a marriage for the bigamy law. So if you have two of these, then you're struck out.
Do you think polygamy makes sense in Canada?
No, partly because the law does not allow it. So it is almost impossible to be fair and just to your wives in this context if you have more than one, because at least one of them will have to be in a secretive or a non-legal way, and she will be deprived of her legal rights. And if you say to keep it fair and square, you have them both in the same situation, you are actually depriving them of the legal rights which are normally available to women in this part of the world, which is unfair to them, both of them at once. And in today's context, the disparity between men and women in terms of the gender of the population composition, that too doesn't make any sense, because nowadays the best estimates show that there are slightly more men in the world than women. The estimates I'm familiar with are that there's about 50.4% men and 49.6% women. So when there are more men than women, the old argument that, okay, you know, some women would be left without husbands if you don't marry 2 or 3 or 4, then that argument fails now, because if you marry a second wife, you might be depriving another man of finding a bride.
Thank you for that, Dr. Shabir. I hope, based on our discussion, that some Muslim men will rethink the practice of polygamy and the harm that it could do to other women. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.